Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about creating a bar exam study schedule. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app, and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about creating a bar exam study schedule. Well, Lee, first off, why would a student even want or need their own study schedule if they bought some commercial bar prep course that just gives them one?
Well, it's important to remember that those study schedules are a one-size-fits-all. And many students have lives, families, jobs, or just need something more individualized to their strengths, weaknesses, how they study, how their brain works. I mean, it's kind of, I think, silly to think that there could be an out-of-the-box answer that would work for everyone.
Right.
Yeah. It's also possible that many of those study schedules are impractical because they really do assume you're going to study sometimes 12 hours a day. Like it's just
7 days a week, no breaks.
Wild what they ask of you. And that is also not practical for a lot of folks because that's just going to lead to burnout. Most people cannot study effectively that many hours.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm very lazy, but I figured I could only really focus for like 4 to 6 hours a day. And that was if I was really trying hard. So, I remember when I was studying for my first exam, I used a kind of random weird program because that's just how I roll. But, I definitely remember kind of putting together my own process of like, okay, what do I think I need to do to pass this test? And that involved a lot of drilling on the MBE with like a very early computer program because I knew that then I would get data and I could actually see how I was doing. It involved like sitting down for a certain amount of time with a certain materials and just like learning certain things and then trying to practice them. I think oftentimes students actually should be supplementing with extra practice.
Right.
And, if you've purchased a variety of materials, like say you've gotten Adaptabar and you've gotten, Themis and you've gotten Smart Bar Prep and you've got the Critical Pass flashcards and you've got, 6 other things, you've got to figure out how to sort of integrate these things into your schedule and figure out what you're going to do with them. How are you going to use Adaptabar? It's obviously not in your schedule probably.
Right. True. And, what of all of those tools that you have purchased are really important for you to incorporate. So for instance, one big difference from Adaptabar than let's say Barbary is Adaptabar uses the real release questions from the NCBE. So if you are working on a Barbary schedule, you might say, well, should I be doing both their questions or Adaptabar, or do I pick one to start with first? What's the data I'm going to get back from the practice? What do I think is going to get me closer to my goals? Like you need to just think, very personally about how you're going to utilize the tools available for you. I also think it's important to remember that we're all not coming to these exams with the same skills. You may have taken a class in law school in which you focused on the performance test. Well, then maybe you shouldn't be spending as much time on the performance test as some study schedules might suggest because maybe you're already doing a great job. Or maybe you got a high score in your evidence class, but you never took wills and trusts. Well, maybe you have to spend more time studying wills and trusts than evidence. I think you have to remember that we all come to it with a unique set of skills and substantive knowledge, and you need to be thoughtful about that as you look at a study schedule and make changes to make it customized to you.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, there's literally no way that your commercial bar prep course could understand what you have studied in law school and what you actually know.
Right.
So why would you just want to blindly follow it? I mean, if you were like wrote your law review note on something related to contracts and you were like a contracts TA, well, you probably don't need to go watch that video. I mean, come on.
Right.
So like, you've got to think about this.
And I think that that's the thing, especially with the videos that we like to highlight for people is you have to ask yourself, is that the best use of my time? If I got an academic award in contracts and the contracts video is 9 hours, which is not outside the realm of possibility. I can't remember how many days they spend on contracts, but it's probably 2 to 3. What could you do in 9 hours? Reviewing an outline from that bar provider or from somebody like Smart Bar Prep, or doing contracts questions in heavily tested areas of the law. I mean, you really need to think about how you're spending your time, how you're putting these kind of deposits in the bank for your bar prep. How are you going to get to your goal? Well, 9 hours of passive listening may not get you anywhere if you are already pretty good at contracts.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you could use like at least half of those 9 hours to study something you've never seen before, and you would probably be giving yourself a lot more chance of passing than spending it on something you're already an expert in.
Or if you spent 9 hours doing contracts practice exams, you would also be even more of an expert in bar contracts than if you spent 9 hours just doing exams and giving yourself feedback. Like that would be
well. And also you could split it between like your exam writing and your MBE questions. True. And great, now you're becoming an expert on the MBE, which is what you need to be to pass the test.
Yep, exactly. So you have to be thoughtful about this. And I think a lot of times people kind of get to this midpoint in their bar prep when they start realizing that it's not really working. And I mean, this happened to me when I took my big commercial bar program around the 4th of July. I kind of scratched my head and was like, I don't actually think I've learned anything. I think I've been working a lot and studying a lot, but I think I'm just stressed out and not at all prepared for this test. I think it's better if you can start thinking about that stuff at the beginning of your prep and evaluating things in the beginning of your bar prep cycle, so you don't get to that what we call the July freakout, where almost everybody stops and says, "Uh-oh, I am so willfully unprepared for this test."
Yeah, I think if you can, it's hard because people think like, I just signed up for this, they'll tell me what to do, I'll pass. And that works for a number of people, but it doesn't work for everyone. Yep. So if you know that, like I knew going into this, I was not a person who really learned that well from like audio lectures. Mm-hmm. And so I just decided I wasn't going to pay for a course that primarily gave me audio lectures. Like I just needed the information. I needed the outlines and I needed the MBE questions and things, but I didn't need the lectures because I knew I wasn't going to watch them. So I think just thinking through, like, from law school what worked for you before. And if it wasn't what you've signed up for, then you got to figure something else out or you're not going to pass.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So if folks want to go rogue, to create their own schedules or edit their own schedules, I think it is important to think about kind of the information you need to start modifying a schedule or creating your own. So, if you're starting from scratch, you're not using a provider, you are studying on your own, you definitely need to make sure you understand what bar exam subjects are on the test and what type of questions are on the exam. And again, the UBE is different from California, which is different from Florida. Make sure you understand what exam you are taking and what those individual requirements are and where they might test state-specific law. So for instance, in California, they only test state-specific law on the essays. And even within the essays, they don't test like state-specific criminal law. They only test certain subjects that are state-specific. Now, not surprising, those show up a lot. So it's important to know them. But you need to really understand the mechanics of the test so you can make sure that you're preparing for all the different parts of it.
And one thing that may seem obvious is you've got to really pay attention to what's on the MBE. So, those are also on the essays. So there are just certain topics that are more critical to know than other topics. And so, you should probably be spending more time doing evidence or contracts or torts or something than you're spending on, say, secured transactions.
True.
If you're taking the UBE, like, okay, that may show up and you need to know it, but it's going to be most one essay. This other stuff can show up all over the place.
That's a very good point. So then you want to look at all the materials you have access to. So do you have access to lectures? Are you purchasing outlines? Do you have access to guided practice questions like our Writing of the Week program and our Practice of the Week workshops, which focus on essays, performance tests, and MPE questions? I mean, you really want to make sure that you understand where your practice is coming from and how you're going to learn how to execute different parts of the test. And you need to take full practice exams, at least half-day practice exams. And so where are you going to get those questions if you aren't signing up for a large commercial course? We have our Brainy Bar Bank tool, which is a bank of questions from California and the UBE that people can pull questions from to create practice exams. But you just need to know where all these materials are going to come from as you kind of build out your study plan.
Right, because everyone needs the basic information, and that can be gotten from a variety of sources. But you need to figure out, like, okay, these are my fundamental places that I'm going to get my information from, and then this is where I'm going to get my practice material from. And then you can start kind of figuring out how to fit all of that into your schedule. And a lot of this really comes down to time. And you have to be, people need to be realistic about this. I think that's probably, we work with a lot of people, and that's one of the biggest pain points is just figuring out how much time you really have to study. And you might say, oh, I've got X number of hours per day. Okay, well, are there any events in there that you need to attend? Is someone having a wedding? Are there holidays in there? Are you working? Do you have family obligations? All of these things play in because it's better to be realistic up front and come up with some type of schedule that you can be realistic about keeping to versus being overly optimistic and then immediately falling behind and then trying to figure out what you're going to jettison. And that's just a very stressful place to be.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, being realistic and then building in a little cushion. Because the other thing that I think people don't plan for, especially for the winter exam, is getting sick. I don't want anyone to get sick. And this is not even just about COVID sick. Like people get the flu during the winter exams. So get your flu shot. But it's also just important to make sure that you're not cutting it so close that you can't get derailed by something happening. If you get sick, you need to take time off and get better. You don't want to be telling yourself that you need to push through, which is just typically going to make you sicker. And then you're not going to be able to function at your best coming the exam days.
Yeah, I had a nightmare scenario where I was supposed to be studying while I was working for California, and I took that as my second bar exam. And of course, I was working in Big Law. I hadn't really studied. And they gave me 3 weeks off. And I literally was so sick the first week that I could not get out of bed.
Yeah.
And that was not a great place to be.
No, I mean, it happens. And, you just got to make sure that you have a little bit of cushion. I think if anything, COVID times have taught us that we can only plan so much because the world just keeps changing on a dime. But it is a good lesson. Like you want to come up with this bar study plan, but you want to build in some flexibility because stuff's still going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of time, how much time does someone actually need to devote for this?
So generally, we say you need about 400 hours to study for the bar. Now, this can go up or down depending on certain factors. Like, do you get time and a half? If you do get time and a half as an accommodation, you're going to need more time to study because your practice exams are going to take longer. You may also, depends on your academic history. Did you really struggle with these bar classes? There are lots of reasons why you might need more time. Or maybe if you're a repeat taker and you were within 5 points of passing, that you just need a refresher and you want to buckle down for 3 weeks and try and get it done. That's a different type of study, but that can work for some people. But generally the 400-hour rule is kind of what we adhere to. And that means studying for about 10 weeks at 40 hours a week, which is a full-time job, but is significantly less than some bar providers say that you need to study. Because we really think it's about 400 high-quality hours, not 400 passive, kind of half looking at social media, half working hours.
Right. We're not, if you're going to study for 400 hours, you can't just be checking the boxes here. You need to be writing basically every day, probably like doing questions from the MBE every day. It has to be very active. It can't just be passive consumption of information because, that's going to take a lot longer to get you to a point of passing.
Yeah.
If you ever get there.
Yeah, it's so true. So it is really important to be thoughtful about kind of where you are and then build out the time. So if you're working and studying and you're only going to be able to study for 20 hours a week, then think about how you're going to find 400 hours unless you think you're in that kind of category of people who can study much less. I think for folks who are working and studying, finding the number of hours to study is the greatest challenge. And also finding the hours that you can study where your brain isn't completely fried from work is also a challenge. So you have to be thoughtful about where those hours are coming from. The hours of 4 to 6 a.m., which sometimes people will tell me they're going to study, for most people aren't going to be great hours. So, for me, I'm like worthless before 7. and my kids get me up really early.
Yeah.
Like I just like there's no way. There are morning people that can do that, but you have to be really honest about yourself if you're going to be able to be productive in some of these hours.
Right. And I think, if you're thinking about how to structure, say, a part-time work, oftentimes people maybe can take some time off. And I think if there's a possibility of taking a full day a week, maybe like a Monday, so then you get basically Saturday, Sunday, Monday that you can study. Yeah. Something like that can be really much more effective than taking off, say, like, working in the morning and then taking part of the afternoon off on a daily basis or semi-daily basis, because you've really got to have that time to turn your brain onto bar study. And so you're going to need some really solid blocks of time.
Yeah.
And if you can carve out like one day a week, I think that's a great part-time schedule, better than trying to do like a few hours every day.
Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so great to think about it as like how many hours a week, because if you take a Friday off or a Monday off from work and you get a good solid 8 hours of studying done that day, well, that's much better than the like 2 hours here, 1 hour at lunch,
right.
Like it's just, it's going to be very different, but you can see how you can kind of trade some of that time for these longer blocks that are going to be much more effective.
Yeah, it's just going to be easier to focus. If you know that every Friday you're studying for the bar, then your brain kind of tunes into that. And it's like, okay, I've got to be really productive on this particular day. Whereas if it's like, oh, I'm going to study between 6 and 8 after I eat dinner, it's just really hard to do that consistently and be effective.
Yep. Yeah. So, it's a lot of this is just about being really realistic. And it sounds really easy to do, but everyone wants to be overly optimistic about what they can actually pull off. It's okay. You just have to, make a plan and then noodle on it and come back to it and ask yourself if you're really being honest with yourself about what you can invest.
Right. And I do think this is a place to be tracking your time. Once you've committed to a plan, actually put it in a calendar and then see, like, am I getting done what I thought I was going to be getting done in those hours? Is this quality study time? Am I even doing the hours?
Yeah.
And if after a week or two you look at it and you're like, okay, I've done 70% of the time I thought, and maybe only about 50% of it's been that productive. Okay, you got to reevaluate.
Yeah. One last thing on like personal family stuff that you might have going on, like somebody getting married or family holidays. I am not of the camp that you should skip everything for the bar. You may need to make some personal sacrifices. You may not be able to have the social calendar that you would hope to have. But if you start skipping a lot of things, it almost gives the test more power than it already has. Like you could plan around going away for a wedding weekend. Now, maybe you can't come back so hungover that you cannot study for 3 or 4 days, but you can still go have that experience and make those memories as long as you've planned for it. So it really is this balance of being thoughtful and thinking about it in these like number of quality hours. So you could start a little early and take some time off. Now, if you're just planning like a random vacation, I probably wouldn't plan that in the middle of your bar prep, but you don't want to miss these kind of milestones because I think that it ends up hurting you in the end.
I think that's definitely possible. And like we said, it's a balance. If it's a 2-week wedding in like the south of France, okay, maybe you can't go for that whole time. Right. Or you go and then you just got to be, I think what you cannot do and should not do is be like, oh, I'm going to go to this, but I'm going to keep studying in those times. You're not going to do that. Come on.
I think that's right. Just be like, I'm going to take 2 or 3 days off, like have a blast and then come back and get my act back together.
Yeah, exactly. You just don't, I feel like don't set yourself up for failure by being unrealistic.
Yeah. So Alison, what do we think should be from a task perspective? Like what are the tasks that should be on an ideal study schedule?
Well, obviously you have to do some degree of substantive review, and that can be kind of however you learn. If you learn from a lecture, maybe that's effective. Oftentimes, to be honest, I think studying from written material is probably more productive for most people. But you're going to have to learn some of this material. And I think you do want to have a short outline of some type, whether it's, Smart Bar Prep or Lean Sheets, or there are probably some other ones out there floating around I'm not thinking of. But you want to have something that actually just condenses the law for you. And then you can always go to these other materials if you need more information. But I feel like what happens a lot of the time is people get really caught up in trying to learn every single thing in the substantive review piece. And then they tell us like, oh, I can't do practice because I don't know enough law. Like, how many times have we heard that?
Oh, yes. Like once a week. At least.
Yeah, or once a day,
once
practically.
A day, during this bar season, at this point in the bar season, once a day.
Yeah, so I was like, I can't do practice because I need to learn more material. It's like, okay, you do not need to learn more material. Probably, you probably already know a decent amount of material, and you know something well enough that you could do a practice question. So I think that's the other thing that really has to be on your schedule is actually doing practice.
Yeah.
So something like the Brainy Bar Bank can give you essays and performance tests. Like our writing of the week is designed to counteract this idea that you can't do something because you don't know the law. Like, great, we'll tell you the law. Now go write the question. So I think you have to call yourself out on this because part of the practice is that's how you learn the law. You don't know what you are going to miss until you do a practice question and you miss an issue. The next time you see a similar issue, you're probably not going to miss it. So a lot of this is just pattern recognition in the end. And the more questions you do, the more you start to see those patterns.
Yeah.
And I think you also need time in your schedule to review the practice questions. This is where people sometimes fall apart. Mm-hmm. So, you do the questions. And I think this happens a lot with the MBE too. People do the questions. Maybe they look at the ones they missed and then they move on with their day. But taking the time to really review what you're not getting correct, I think is so critical.
Also, for the MBE, you also have to make sure that you're getting them right for the right reasons. I think more and more that people just say like, oh, well, if I got it right, I don't have to worry about it. But you might be getting it right because you guessed and you just happened to guess right. That doesn't really give me confidence for you going into the test because that doesn't mean that you knew the law or really knew what you were doing. It was a 50-50 shot and you just, picked the right one. So I think you also need to just study the questions. They can only get so creative about the types of fact patterns they use on this test. And so the more you study the questions, the more you are going to be ready for whatever ones show up on the actual exam.
Yeah, and one thing we've had people do if they're really struggling with the MBE is kind of take a step back from just doing a lot of questions and like checking that box and actually use these as a teaching tool. So do them open book, take as much time as you need, but that means that you need to actually look up the law if you don't know exactly what rule is being tested. You need to walk through that hypo, like what is the issue? What is the rule? Go look it up. Once you have the rule in front of you, you should be able to figure out what is the answer supposed to look like and then find that answer choice. So slowing down and using these as a teaching tool can actually be really effective. Yeah. But you got to have time in your schedule for that.
That's right, which is why you got to start early. Make sure you have enough hours so you can slow down and do that sort of very focused practice. I think with the practice exams, you want to do, in the beginning, maybe you're not doing as much, time pressured practice because you are still learning. You're looking things up. That's fine. But I think you can also get way overly indulgent with this and start spending 3 hours on a question, or a 30-minute ME takes you 2 hours. And then you feel good about yourself because you wrote this amazing answer in 2 hours. You have 30 minutes on that test to do it. 2 hours. A 2-hour answer doesn't really teach you anything. So I think that you want to start with like saying, okay, well, if I have to look up the law, maybe I spend 45 minutes on a 30-minute question. And then as you get closer and closer to the exam, you're like, now I can go, 40 minutes and 35 minutes and then 30 minutes, because you do have to kind of whittle it down to really get comfortable writing the best possible answer you can under timed conditions. So there is a balance between learning from the questions and then doing the actual practice.
Definitely. And I think this should all be in your schedule. There should be days in your schedule at a certain point where you commit to, I am not doing this open book anymore.
Right.
There needs to be a day in your schedule where you commit to like, okay, after today, I only have 35 minutes on each MEE question. After today, a couple of weeks later, I only have 30 minutes. Like you have to be getting closer and closer to the reality of it. And I think putting that in up front, because otherwise it's really easy just to slide into like, oh, I just need another few days of open book. Oh, I just need another few days before I can do it timed. And then you're at the end and you're still not doing them.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think sometimes people like kind of cut corners and don't do half-day practice exams. I think this is a huge mistake because fatigue is something that we really see. You have to have stamina to do this test. It's not an easy thing to do. And when we get scores, when people haven't done a lot of time to practice in these kind of half-day chunks at least, you can see how at the end of each session, the scores will start to dip from fatigue. It's like you can see it on the score sheet. So also building into your schedule, like when am I going to do a half-day practice of MBEs? When am I going to do a half-day practice of essays? When am I going to do the half-day practice of PTs? Whatever your test looks like, building that out and making sure that you're comfortable with that. Also remembering that during that practice time, you often can't have water at your desk. You can't have snacks. You want to start recreating the conditions in which you take the test, because that can be another issue for folks. If you're really used to having water at your desk or eating nuts all day, and then you take that stuff away, it can make it a lot harder to focus.
Definitely. And again, if you're getting accommodations, you need to make sure you're doing the test as you're actually going to be taking it.
Right. So what about kind of putting this all together? We haven't really talked about the performance test, so we should talk a little bit about that. I mean, we really think you need to at least be doing one performance test a week, because this is the easiest part of the test to pick up easy points, because you don't need to know any law. So please don't ignore the poor PT. People do it. They get bad scores and they pull their writing score down, and it's just heartbreaking. It makes me so sad.
It's really frustrating when we see scores where like, but for your terrible performance on the performance test, you would have passed this test. And that is just not ideal.
Yeah.
So, I think it can be challenging, but the more you do, the more of them you see, the more comfortable you get.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. At least one of those a week. When you're thinking about kind of structuring your subjects, if you think about, repetition and seeing things again and again, you probably want to rotate through the subjects at least twice, maybe even 3 times, so that you're not spending like 1 week on contracts, 1 week on torts. You're probably going to run out of time on some of those at the end and not cover them at all, which is a disaster. So better that you spend, 2 days on contracts, 2 days on torts, and 1 day on wills and trusts, and then at least you've seen them all. If you get to the end, it's not like, oh, I've never seen a wills question. I've never studied this. That's a disaster.
Well, that's why we always talk about in our program is focusing on the heavily tested areas of the law, because you were mentioning it earlier, Allison, how you can get so caught up in just like trying to learn all these legal facts, all the law that could possibly be tested. Instead, if you come at it as this idea of minimum competency, which is I need to know all of the heavily tested law cold, and then I'm going to learn all of these nuances, that is going to be a much better way to study. And then every time that you hit the subject, you're going to see, more and more of that heavily tested law, and you're going to have the bandwidth to pull in those nuances, which is great. That is better than I'm trying to learn absolutely everything I can about torts in 4 hours. Well, that's just not practical. And we're not asking you to do that. And the thing is, that's not even what's going to be the difference maker between passing and failing the test.
Right, exactly. It's like if you can't do a competent negligence analysis on the basics and a question on that comes up, you've got problems. But like some tiny little detail about, some this, that, or the other, you're probably not going to need that. So yeah, basically as you're rotating through the subjects, you can think about doing a full practice exam after each round of subjects. And I think that's going to show you kind of where you're at after, maybe say that it's been 3 weeks of study. And then you've gone through each subject, you don't know everything, but then you do a test and you kind of see where you're at. And then you go back into it and you review the things that you didn't know. That kind of cycle is going to help with the spaced repetitions and just getting this stuff more in your brain.
Yeah. So once you've kind of got the study schedule, it is important that, you're kind of making sure that you're staying on track and that you are tracking your progress, evaluating and pivoting if necessary. So we have already talked about it, but we have to keep saying it because it's so important that you have to be realistic about your time needs and commitments outside of studying for the bar. So you're not surprised. I often will hear from people who are working. It's like, well, I have this job and I had a trial come up, and it's like, didn't you know about the trial? Like trials usually you have a lot of warning. Like, why are you studying for the bar while you're in trial prep? That's practically impossible. It's
right. Or when that came up, why did you not decide okay, this exam is not happening given that I'm in trial, so I'm going to have to push it to the next one. just push it. It's much better to take it when you're ready.
Yeah, exactly. So you just want to be really realistic. And you can use technology to keep yourself organized, to keep track of any study schedule that you're making, tools like Trello, Asana, whatever kind of to-do app that you like to use. You could use a Google Calendar. You could use all sorts of different things. But I think the key is that you want to make sure that you're tracking what you're getting done, but also holding yourself accountable. And sometimes you need other people outside of just technology to hold yourself accountable. So you may want to have a study buddy or friends or family that you kind of talk to about your progress. Sometimes this can be a lonely process if you're doing it by yourself, and it can be hard to stay on task.
Yeah, and this is where I would always do the circles method, to really force myself to see what am I actually getting done. We can link to a post about that, but one of my favorite time management techniques and things, and it really is all about accountability. And it also can make you feel better because you can look back at all the stuff, everything you've checked off is basically a deposit in the bank of passing the bar. So you can go back and be like, okay, I have been working through this. I have been doing this. So I think it can help with stress levels too. Yep. If you want to purchase templates, we have those. You can get them through our self-study program. This is what we designed them for. But, you've got to focus on really what's working for you and what doesn't work for you. And I think if we just go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, I just really encourage people not to just accept a template that someone else has done for them and say, okay, this is what I need to do, because nobody knows what you need to do as well as you do.
I agree. And I think that's really the key. If you are in the process of working through a large commercial program, just take a beat and just ask yourself, how's it going? Do I need to make any changes? Do I need to customize this more for me? It's not like you can't pivot at any point in the process, but you want to pivot and make changes as early as possible so you can get the benefit of that extra time that you're not going to be doing certain activities that aren't getting you closer to your goal, because then you can take that time and allocate it to active learning activities and then get closer to passing. So
that should be our slogan. Pivot to active.
Pivot to active. There we go. New slogan. All right. Well, any final thoughts for bar studiers as they think about customizing their study schedules?
I would just say I would like to empower people to feel that they are able to do this and that they probably should do this, because I think there can be a lot of passive thoughts around just, I'm not qualified to say what I should do to pass this test. And I just really don't think that's true. I think you're the best person who's qualified to say what you need to do, and you should feel empowered to do that.
I think that's very true. I think one other thing to keep in mind is you need to take care of your whole person. So in that study schedule, make sure you're getting sleep, you are eating well, you are doing some sort of movement for your body, and you are, connecting with your community and doing things with friends or family that make you feel good, because that stuff outside of your study schedule is also critical to making sure that you can show up to invest in the hours that you have.
Very true.
All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on our favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. Good luck with your study schedules, and we'll talk soon.